intrusion of COVID-19 in the middle of the spring semester caught all of us off guard and impacted our lives in so many ways and disrupted academic and life experiences of our students. When the pandemic hit, the college life went remote. There were a lot of questions about how our students would be impacted, what kind of challenges they would face, how will our students deal with the situation. Towards the end of the spring semester, somewhere in between April and May, more than 3,500 Montgomery College students participated in a nationwide survey in an attempt to find answers to those questions. Today, we will hear what students across the country, including Montgomery College students, had to say. Without further ado, our illustrious president, Dr. Darian Pollard, will introduce our guest speaker.
Well, thank you, Dr. Blaylock, and good morning to our colleagues. I'm so excited to see you all here and look forward to a really rewarding experience. If you were here or were able to attend the opening meeting on Monday, I know that you heard a lot about our message about how deeply our students have been impacted by the pandemic, just as you heard Dr. Blaylock talk about a moment ago. And you may have heard yesterday Jeffrey Salingo's talk where he explained the pandemic has, quote, upended higher ed. That is traditionally based on face-to-face learning. I'm sure you've noticed, and he mentioned the power of data for crafting solutions to better serve our students all year long, and also talked about what this looks like in periods of crisis. Some of the data from the Hope Center that you're going to hear about in a moment convey some realities about what our students have experienced. And I'll share just a few very quickly because Dr. Gojek Rob is going to really take us in depth on this. 41% of students who were working before COVID lost employment, and 33% of them had reduced income. Importantly, 63% of our students reported to the Hope survey that they were struggling with basic needs insecurity. The survey will certainly provide a snapshot. It was invaluable in helping us have context and clues about the lived experiences of our students in this very moment. In fact, that data has been so important, and I love the fact that it's become the center of this year's Data Summit. I think as an organization, we're developing our sophistication around data and how we use data to both convey the stories of our students while also being quite deliberate about trying to use it to advance the work that needs to be done within our organization. We've come quite a bit. We didn't have a student success scorecard, which has come to us certainly in the last several years. And we know now that data is essential to this agenda around radical inclusion that we so readily embrace at Montgomery College. Not simply about how students get into the door, which we tend to privilege the access part of our mission, but data helps us magnify the success part of our mission, how they get to the goals that they articulate at the organization. It informs us in terms of how we design our student success work as we look particularly around our work in advising, our work around guided pathways, starting smart, and certainly scheduling for student success. Now, most of you in this virtual room are already sold in the value of data. That's probably why you're here right now. And I'm not going to preach to the choir because I'm also not the best evangelist in that space. We are filled at Montgomery College with true people who understand this work and who do extraordinary work. Our data ambassadors, both in terms of Dr. Blaylock, Mr. Hammond, but all of our OIR team, and certainly the number of folks who serve on our data team. I want to thank you for that because you are deliberately, day by day, changing the way we do the work at the college, and you're bringing down barriers. We have a lot of outspoken data ambassadors around us, but the level of engagement, I think, has been profound. And it's important in this moment of COVID that we're using data to make decisions. Many of you saw my memo that came out on Monday about the college switching to more 7-week classes in the spring, and that was a data-rich decision. Research has shown that students perform better in these short-term courses, and they want to have more offerings of this nature during this uncertain period. So we're going to be pivoting, and that's another strength of data. Data allows us to be able to redesign experiences in ways that are responsive to students. Now, one person who has done an extraordinary job of being a data-rich, data-informed, and data warrior and helping to magnify the experiences of students, particularly students who are in so many needs, having so many profound needs that have to be responded to, is certainly no stranger to Montgomery College, but certainly no stranger to the work that we do in community colleges. That Dr. Sarah Goldrick-Robb, she's professor of sociology and medicine. And I saw that. I meant to ask you, Sarah, about the medicine part, but maybe at some point you can tell me about that, at Temple University. And she's the founding director of the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice in Philadelphia. She's also the chief strategy officer for Emergency Aid at Equity, a student financial success and emergency aid company. And she founded Believe in Students, a nonprofit distributing emergency aid. Now, when Dr. Goldrick-Robb contacted us to ask if Montgomery College could be included in the survey, I did not hesitate. And as you'll hear later, this data is so rich in helping us understand who our students are. And we had an excellent response rate from our students because I think they're hungry to convey their lived experiences as well. Dr. Goldrick-Robb's record on large national studies on food and housing insecurity in higher education is renowned. Her article on the Atlantic America Sabotage the Solution is Higher Education Crisis, centered on the CARES Act inequities. She has been a champion for this work for us. And the Chronicle of Education calls Sarah, quote, a defender of impoverished students and a scholar of their struggles, an accurate description of her work. She's the recipient of the American Educational Research Association's Early Career Award and a Carnegie Fellowship. Now, here's an interesting one that I love. Political Magazine named her one of the top 50 people shaping American politics in 2016, and she is ranked 7th in the nation among education scholars, according to Education Week. All of that being said, I'd like to say she is just a delightful human. As I was sharing, some of you may have heard before we came on, I had the privilege of getting to know Sarah first through social media because she's prolific. And what I love about her is her rawness, her honesty. She talks about the things that make her excited and the things that concern her. And she's unafraid and she's bold and courageous. So it's that spirit that I am so happy to have her here at Montgomery College today. And I'm just going to be like everybody else and become a student of Sarah Goldrick-Robb yet again. So thank you. And Sarah, welcome to Montgomery College again.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Pollard. This is such a treat, and I, can't help once again wish that we did not have to all be stuck in our homes and that I could be with you today at your college. I had so much fun visiting last time, and I learned a lot, and I really, really enjoyed being able to go and sit in some classrooms with your faculty and staff and have conversations. I do have to say, I know that since I was there, a number of your folks there have been following me on social media, and we've been able to interact more and to deepen that dialogue a bit, and that's been wonderful. So hi to all of you who I have had that chance to interact with. And I will very happily, also give you a little bit of detail about where we have been since I last saw you. This Real College survey that I'm about to share some data on from your institution is part of a larger movement. The Real College movement started 5 years ago. And, if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, we would be just about to celebrate at a big party. The fact that over the last 5 years, we've successfully helped with our partners to move the conversation about students' basic needs from a real side issue to a really central issue. And as part of that, we've really come to understand that these challenges that students face and the corresponding issues of both poverty and racism are part of the social determinants of health. And when we think about health, we all readily understand what an enormous impact that has on our lives and the enormous costs that we bear as a society when our health is not good. And, no better illustration of that than right now. So we did seek at Temple University to make a move to strengthen our position, both in terms of building our capacity to do the work and strengthening our team. And you all work in higher education, you know very well that also strengthening your financial position is critical. And where better to do that than in the amazing Lewis Katz School of Medicine at Temple. So we are now part of the School of Medicine as of July 1st, and my position is now tenured in sociology with an appointment in medicine. And I'm delighted about that because it's going to allow us to continue to pursue the study of these disparities in connection to some newer issues around the implications of these things for both mental and physical health, for your students' stress, for their sleep. And we're going to have some new talent at the table to be able to help us to do that work. So we're really thrilled about it. Now, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because this is a data summit. So we are going to get to the data. And that's just incredibly important. And I do want to say, we always appreciate the way Montgomery College answers the call when we ask, will you participate in a survey? Recognizing that colleges have a lot going on. It's not like you all weren't busy. It's not like your students didn't have other things to be focused on as well. And yet they and you took the time to answer a survey, and we really appreciate that. I'm going to start, though, by taking a step back from the data. I did this when I was with you before, but I also have some updates in this area. So I want to explain for a moment about why it is that we would be seeing so many challenges with students' basic needs. And in particular, I want to emphasize that while we are in this extraordinary moment right now with the pandemic, we were already facing a crisis of students' basic needs and security for a variety of reasons. And in my book, Paying the Price, I lay out a framework for thinking about this that I call the new economics of college. And what I do there is I contrast essentially the old economics, which you might think of as the economics of, let's say, the 60s and 70s, to the new economics, which really have their origins in the 1980s, but became extremely evident during the first part of this century. And then I think at this point, we have to start to talk about the pandemic economics. And that's going to be this new world that we're living in. It's not just going to be while the pandemic itself is really ongoing, but also in whatever a post-pandemic world looks like. So I break this down into 5 areas in my book, and you'll see that I've added a 6th now. The first one has to do with the burden of price. We talk a lot about tuition, talk a lot about, how the role of the federal government and such. But the bottom line is that the burden of price has shifted onto students. And that's a big change. If you talk to people who went to college a long time ago, they'll say to you, this is doable. You can work it if you want to work it. And the fact is they're largely referring to a time when, they might have worked it, but the government helped them out a lot. And that has not been the case for a while. And I believe now, thanks to the major economic challenges that we are facing, that we're going to see the student carry more and more of the burden of price. At the same time, we see that their ability to pay is changing. The family economics of college refer not only to what's happening to families and in terms of their wage stagnation and the fact that many of them lost any wealth and assets that they might have had, and in fact are carrying a lot of debt. That's one part of the family economics. But the other part is that our students have a complex array of family structures. We can't assume anymore that the undergraduate comes to college with 2 parents employed and supporting him or her. We can't assume that at all. Many of these folks have children of their own, as you all well know. Many of them who don't have children of their own are nonetheless supporting younger siblings, cousins, etc. And some folks are also supporting their parents. And as a result, these shifts, like you can see here, so changes in the growth of wages and changes in economic inequality, and in particular wealth inequality, which has disproportionately affected the African American community. Those things play out on our campuses because this is why students cannot just turn to family and ask them to fill in when funds run short. We also know that students have long worked their way through college to make ends meet. And while some people are just coming to realize that, it is in fact an old story. The real change is not that students today are working and they didn't used to, it's that work has shifted. So it was already becoming so much harder for our students to be able to find a job that actually met the criteria associated with their class schedule. Many employers have looked at them and said, we want someone with more flexibility in their lives. And we already had a problem with the declining value of the minimum wage. Even the conversations about increasing the living wage or increasing the wage to a living standard have not actually resulted in policy changes that have increased it anywhere near sufficiently to support a family. Now we have an entire new layer to this conversation. One of the most popular industries for college students to work in is the restaurant industry, which is suffering incredibly during this pandemic. We also see, again, racial disparities in this regard, such that students of color are much more likely to be in those frontline worker jobs, performing incredible support in health professions. And so they might be employed, but they're not safe while they're doing so. Of course, we also know that the social safety net, by which I mean policies including SNAP, or you might think of it as food stamps, TANF, or what you might call cash assistance, the earned income tax credit, and other supports, including unemployment insurance, these things in the past were actually there to catch college students when they began to fall, when the FAFSA didn't result in enough resources. And we knew that that safety net was being shredded and that was having effects on students even before the pandemic. For example, we saw that work requirements, which were added to the SNAP program after they were added to the Temporary Aid for Needy Families program, those were keeping many college students, particularly those without children, from actually being able to access the food that they needed. Now, post-pandemic, we're seeing something, or in the pandemic, we're seeing something even more troubling, which is that as Congress rolls out supports for regular people without a lot of money, they're continuing to exclude people who are enrolled in college from these programs. So we saw this with the stimulus checks. We are seeing this still with SNAP. So colleges have implored the US Department of Agriculture to please allow students to have access to SNAP without meeting a work requirement because of widespread unemployment, a move that they have consented to and allowed to have happen to other able-bodied adults who don't have children, but they're not allowing that for college students. So the continued shredding and dismantling of any form of safety net leaves the colleges and the students without as much to lean on. And then, of course, there's government funding support. Now, this doesn't mean, by the way, that the federal government and state governments are not spending more on higher ed than they have in the past, but that's not the relevant issue. The relevant issue is how much money do they spend on a per student basis. Unfortunately, there are two problems. One is that the federal government and the states never really agreed that they should together fund higher education. The states have vacillated a lot over time, and whenever they've felt that they had to make cuts or establish priorities, they have deprioritized higher education time and again. In addition, because the important calculation is the amount of money available to support each student, unfortunately, most of our states and the federal government allocate that support not per student, but per full-time equivalent student, which is to say they take your part-time students and treat them as less than full-time human beings. That's precisely why it is so easy for a college like yours to fall short on the dollars that it needs for student support services. They'll get additional funding per hour of instruction that a student registers for. They'll get more instructional expenditures, but they won't get more support for all of the other things that students need, which we know are absolutely critical to their success. And this is the sixth area that we have to pay attention to, which was not in my book, although we did have some evidence even then of challenges facing students' mental health. Health and well-being is a critical element of college success. It's quite clear that if a student is ill, they can't be in classes doing very well. Some of them are trying to, but it's a struggle. So now we are really coming to understand the important role that our colleges must play, not only in terms of providing health services on campus, but also in terms of providing health education, helping people, for example, understand the importance of masks, helping them understand what steps they can take to protect their communities. Because as we all now know, health is a community concern. So that's the backdrop against which basic needs insecurity in higher education is occurring. And we got to grapple with that full backdrop if we really want to make a dent. I think you can probably tell by now I'm a sociologist. Social structures matter, the institutions around us, everything from the economic structure to the structure around our faith and religion, to the environment, and yes, to politics, matter in these conversations. And of course, we also know that racial disparities, which I'm happy that we are paying more and more attention to and unhappy about the reasons that we have had to, these things exacerbate the new economics of college for Black and Brown students. And I want to also note, even though it's not explicitly on the side, for Indigenous students as well. It is notable to me that in many of our conversations about back to college, the tribal colleges and universities, which are some of the most deeply affected, are rarely spoken about. So the real question in front of us as we look at this data is, can education happen if students' basic needs are not met? And if it must happen, what does that look like? And I think the answers have to begin with a really clear-headed sense of what the data are in fact showing us. Because, for example, if the data were showing us that only a tiny fraction of our students were affected, then our approach might be to essentially scaffold and target a narrow set of supports. On the other hand, if this is a widespread problem, that targeting, that effort to try to narrow the supports to a strategic group of people might inadvertently just make it harder for students to access the help. That's just one example of why the data are going to be important. Now, as you know, the data came from a survey we did last spring. I do want to give a shout out to my Hope Center team because this was not an easy lift. We had just finished putting out the results from last fall's survey in February when suddenly the pandemic hit. And I looked at them and said, we don't have any choice, we have to go back into the field. And that's hard because normally March and maybe April are a time when my team gets a little bit of rest, at least a tiny bit. And instead we had to begin asking colleges, will you please do this survey, and then immediately start to roll this thing out. So we were super grateful, as I said, that you all joined us, and you can see that you were one of 39 two-year colleges around the country. And in addition, 15 four-year universities also stepped up to join us. This is purely voluntary. There is no mandate that any institution do this survey. And we were really glad to have you all spread across 26 states, which is not bad. You might notice we don't have anybody in California, which we normally do. And that's because we did an entire separate study with the California Community Colleges in a partnership with one of their organizations. And that report is coming soon. So in total, we sent this survey to the entire institution at each of the places, and we got responses from just over 38,000 students. Now, let's be honest, that's less than 1 in 10 students. And I think, to be honest, that's normal. Unfortunately, it's the case that getting an electronic survey to students with compromised internet access, compromised access to their email, a functioning computer challenge, and those who are just frankly too busy, it's a real thing. And we can also be honest that even folks like ourselves delete these surveys or ignore them every day. So I think the real issue is, were the 3,500 students at your college who answered the survey, whose data we will now look at, were these those in the most distress? Or is it possible that these numbers actually reflect a lower bound estimate of the distress? Is it possible that the students who did not get or did not answer the survey were in even more trouble? My instinct is yes, that's the case. Because I tend to think that the students who are living in overcrowded homes with limited internet, those who don't speak English, which is how our survey is delivered, those who are raising kids and busy doing that, are probably less likely to actually complete the survey. But they are more likely to be experiencing basic needs insecurity. So I want you to think about that as we examine the numbers. Now, as your president revealed, our overall estimate of any basic needs insecurity at your institution is there at the bottom. 63% of your students had at least one thing going on. Now, when I say going on, I want to clarify. We're talking about food insecurity as measured by the USDA's validated measure. We asked students about whether the things included in food insecurity had happened to them in the last 30 days. So they were taking this survey between the 4th week of the pandemic and the 8th week of the pandemic. And food insecurity, therefore, if measured, would have happened in the last 30 days. We also asked about housing insecurity and homelessness through a whole series of items. In breaking from our tradition, which is to ask about those things in the last year, in this case, we asked about them on the day the student took the survey. That means that these numbers cannot be directly compared to other estimates, which were about 12 months of data, or 365 days. These numbers tell you that in a single day, during weeks 4 through 8 of the pandemic, 11% of your students were experiencing homelessness on that day. And that puts you right on par with the numbers we saw for the other two-year colleges. We also saw that your rate of food insecurity was a bit higher than the average for the other two-year colleges, as was your rate of housing insecurity. Now, I want to break that down by race ethnicity. We ask students to self-identify their race ethnicity. We offer them 11 options, or they can write it in. I understand that here I am breaking this down by the 3 largest groups of your students. It is possible to do further disaggregation, but for purposes of illustration here, I'm going to focus on white students, Black students, they identify as either Black or African American, and Latinx students. Those students indicate that they were either Hispanic or Latino or Latina. Okay, so as you can see here, white students experience basic needs insecurity at lower rates than Black or Latinx students. Now that should not be surprising, but we can see the magnitude of those disparities here. And I think they're really important. So for example, if we compare that, we just take that Black-white gap, right? About 74% of your Black students had experienced basic needs insecurity, compared to about 50% of white students. One of the things I'm really struck by is that is about the same size as the national Black-white gap in college completion rates. Think about that for a second. The gap in basic needs insecurity mirrors the national gap in college completion rates. We also see very sizable gaps with regard to food insecurity. There's a 29 percentage point disparity between white students and Black students with regard to food insecurity. And Black students are 9 percentage points more likely to be food insecure compared to Latinx students. We also see that they are more likely to be housing insecure, and they are a bit more likely to be homeless as well. Now, your president also mentioned job insecurity, and this is really important. We found that about 70% of students were employed before the pandemic. That was the average across the survey. We can see here what happened to them, and this is disaggregated again by race ethnicity. So let's start with the good news. For whom could the student say, nothing changed with my job, at least in terms of money, right? It might have gotten harder. It might have meant that there were health changes, right? So if they were a frontline worker, they might have been in a more dangerous situation. We can see that 38% of white students were able to say nothing had changed with my job. And that compares to 26% of Black students. How many students said, I saw reduced hours or pay? Well, that happened to, again, about 36% of white students, but 41% of Black students. When it comes to actually losing your job by weeks 4 through 8 of the pandemic, we see that that happened to 29% of white students, 34% of Latinx students, and 36% of Black students. Okay. Now, it's remarkable that we talk about this just in terms of job loss without thinking about the broader issue, which is that Black and Latinx students have to do more to get a job in the first place. There's plenty of evidence of racial discrimination still pervasive in hiring. So in other words, the stakes here for the job loss are also even greater for these folks. They're especially magnified for Black and brown students because their families also have less wealth to help them endure a job loss. In fact, they're much more likely to have debt, which means a job loss could in turn exacerbate a problem where they're not able to pay on that debt and could begin to ruin their credit. We understood, of course, that this could affect how the students were doing in school, and we wanted to ask them about their ability to concentrate. They were asked to rate their ability to concentrate, and these are those who said that they had at least moderate difficulty concentrating on school. Now, this is interesting. We do see that Black students were less likely to say that, and that white students and Latinx students were more likely to say they had difficulty concentrating on school. I do want to put this into some context. There is social psychological evidence that African Americans in particular have grown more accustomed to ongoing struggle and are less likely to report that as a new thing or a difficult thing because it has essentially become normalized. They are also more likely to report, in contrast to any other racial group, that they experience an external locus of control, which means as opposed to an internal locus of control where they feel that their decisions control their life. They feel more that other forces are controlling their life. And there is some evidence that this is actually functional, that this helps, because in fact, in American society, so much of African American life is dictated by structures that are beyond the control of individuals. We also see, of course, high levels of stress or anxiety. Now, again, we didn't just ask stress or anxiety, we didn't just ask about anxiety, we assessed it using a validated instrument. Nonetheless, some students are much less likely to answer these questions. They are stigmatized for some, but we can see here that Latinx students were the most likely to be experiencing anxiety. We also wanted to understand one of the big contributors to that stress and to economic challenges and to time poverty, which is a really important part of financial poverty that students experience, and that comes from taking care of family. Now, we ask this question in a broad way because we don't want to make any assumptions that just because a student doesn't have a financial dependent, what we also call a child, that doesn't mean that they don't have family obligations. And as you can see here, Black and Latinx students were much more likely than white students to say that they were trying to take care of family while also going to school during a pandemic. I can tell you, I started teaching again this week, and I teach at Temple University, which is not a community college, but we are the only public university in the city of Philadelphia. And our students, many of them come in without standardized test scores because we're test optional. In the very first set of 14 of my 30 students who filled out our student survey, I already saw that more than half of them have family obligations, and quickly noted that while only 2 of them say they have children of their own, they are taking care of multiple siblings, trying to facilitate their schooling during the pandemic, in addition to cousins, in addition to supporting older relatives who are having health challenges. So again, this can take many, many varieties and forms. Now, one of the big things that we really have come to focus on, and this is an area where we want institutions to really begin to focus on this as a measure of improvement over time. The big goal is not so much that you don't have students experiencing food insecurity, because let's be honest, that's a challenge that the college is not going to resolve just by itself. And it's also a challenge, right, that speaks to structural issues. You could continue to have students who are food insecure by virtue of the fact that the social safety net is being cut and the fact that your doors are open. You don't gate your admissions. But what you can do is work to increase the fraction of your students who get connected to supports. So here we focus on 3. Unemployment, which was critical, of course, and continues to be critical during the pandemic. SNAP, so that students can eat, and emergency aid on campus. And what we note here, and this is very similar to what we saw around the country, is that only 22% of your students who report having experienced some type of basic needs insecurity, only 22% of them applied for unemployment. Only 9% of them applied for SNAP, and only 22% of them applied for your emergency aid. Now, granted, I want to contextualize that, especially around the emergency aid. This is pre-CARES Act. We are going in the fall into a whole new survey and data collection that is related to the CARES Act and to the many emergency aid programs that grew post-May at colleges and universities. But what we can see here is that one of your challenges was that 29% of your students believed that emergency aid was either unavailable at your college or that they were ineligible for it. 27% simply said, I didn't know about it. Okay? And 22% said, I didn't know how to apply. So there's an area to focus on to try to help them make those connections. We can see that the situation is a little different in terms of the causes of the problems for unemployment and SNAP. The most important thing is that students perceive unemployment and SNAP as being unavailable to them, or that they're ineligible for it. And I want to suggest this is not a coincidence. The federal government has written up these programs and written the rules for these programs in ways that are intended to make people think they're ineligible. That makes our job harder. Our job is to convince the students they very well might be eligible and give them support so that they will actually apply. Now let's break this down further and look at this by race ethnicity. So let's just take unemployment for a minute. One of the things that we can see, it's fascinating, actually, that awareness that unemployment was available is actually lower among white students, okay? African American students were the ones who were most likely to know that it was available. But we can also see they were the most likely to not know how to apply. Okay? So that's an area where, helping students understand not only that the program exists, because 17% of Black students said, I did not know about the program, and helping them apply will have disproportionate benefits for African American students, particularly because they were also more likely to lose their jobs. With regard to SNAP, we can see some similar things. It's the white students who think that the program doesn't apply to them that they can't get it. But again, we see that Black students were more likely to say, I just didn't even know about it. And they were, along with Latinx students, more likely to say, I did not know how to apply. Okay? So while Black students are more likely to have applied, which is probably because they are disproportionately likely to need this support and have deeper levels, for example, of food insecurity compared to other students, they still could really benefit from additional on-campus support to make them aware of the program, make them aware that they're eligible, and to actually help them navigate the application. Finally, with regard to emergency aid, again, really interesting that so many white students believed that emergency aid was simply not available to them on the campus, or again, perceived their ineligibility. Whereas students of color were more likely to say, I just didn't know about it, or really notably, I didn't know how to apply. And that includes more than 1 in 4 Latinx students. Okay, so this again points the way for some additional work. In my last couple moments before we open it up for questions, I want to give you a few areas to continue to work on. And the first one builds on what I just said. Continuing to increase your utilization of existing resources is critical. Some of that is clearly about information, just letting students know. And the key here is that you got to tell them again, and then tell them again. You got to tell them in multiple different forms. You should use video, you should use audio, and you should use written form. You should tell them all the time. Tell them at least once a month. Because sometimes you're not telling them at the moment when they most need to hear it. We also need to find ways to destigmatize access to this support. And I'm really excited that we just secured some new support from the federal government to work with Dallas College on testing different types of messaging that can go to students this fall to see whether messages that have explicit language around destigmatization and empowerment actually increase utilization of services beyond those that simply provide information. We're going to be reporting out on that study just as soon as we have some information, hopefully by the end of the fall, because we know how useful that could be. Second, we need to be talking about these challenges in the classroom because these issues are playing out in the classroom. Some of you know, and I've been tweeting about my new course, which I got a lot of help on from Digital Pedagogy Lab. And what I'm trying to do, even though I'm teaching sociology of education, is to really integrate discussion of basic needs and security into my curriculum. Which means when we look at some data and a way to build quantitative literacy, we're just going to so happen to look at some data on food insecurity. It means that when I talk about how people navigate and get access to resources in our society, I'm going to use examples from unemployment. There are many ways to bring these things into the classroom. At the very least, we just need to continue to remind students that we know that they are humans first and center that and express to them the importance that we understand that how they do in our class relates to these challenges. And the last thing is that this is the time to advocate for your local government, for your state government, and for your federal government to take action, and for philanthropy to increase funds, not only for emergency aid, but also for staff support to help you connect your students to public benefits programs, and for additional support so that your staff and faculty can have good working conditions and professional development that will help them lean into this work as well. That's the real potent combination that will matter. It is a combination of government support and philanthropic support, and let's be honest, private sector support, at least in terms of the advocacy, if not for direct service, is going to also be essential. I'm sure we are all cognizant that this is at core a political moment. It is a political moment from a health perspective. It is a political moment from a racial disparities perspective. Basic needs insecurity is a political issue. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I am going to tell you that one really good way to address basic needs insecurity at your institution is for all of you, including all of your students, to vote together. And with that, I'm going to stop and stop sharing my screen and happily take your questions. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you so much for this, Sarah. This has been a great overview of this survey. There's a lot of things in here to kind of unpack. And so we want to ask you just a couple of questions. I'll pull some of the things, that have been coming in over the chat. If there's other questions, feel free to type them in. The first question we had was, could you explain a little bit about why you focus on housing insecurity versus homelessness?
Yeah, so we focus on both. One way to think about housing insecurity, and there really is a big debate in the larger field among experts on housing, but housing insecurity might also be considered near homelessness, okay? So basically that's a set of conditions where you are at risk of losing your home. So if you are having trouble paying your rent, or you're paying your mortgage late, or you are not paying your utility bills on time, or you're skipping bills, that is a leading indicator of the likelihood that you will experience homelessness. And that's actually a reason, by the way, that utility companies are often so willing to work with people to try to help them pay their bills. They even have programs, some of them, to get you ahead of the inability to pay by right-sizing your bill to what you can afford. Because utility companies fundamentally benefit when you stay in your home. They don't want you to lose your home. So we actually think one of the best things a college can do to try to prevent homelessness is to make students aware of all of the utility assistance programs that are available before students actually need emergency aid for them. But it's those kinds of things. The other kind of thing that plays out here is with regard to safety. Some of housing insecurity is also about students knowing they're in a place where they are not safe to be. Nationwide, during this survey, we found that 6% of those 38,000 people said they were not safe in their home on the day of the survey, which is really terrifying. And we know around the country that partner violence and such has been a major concern during the pandemic. And it's another reason why I also believe that to the extent that we can provide pro bono legal services to our students, they'll benefit from them.
Yeah, that is sobering and scary. That reminds me of one of the questions that came up here. Do we know anything about the impact on the LGBTQ students in particular? Like, I don't know if that was part of the survey questions, but maybe some
yeah. It is. I'm really glad that we have been asking those questions. We've been asking them for quite a while. So we allow students to select from a variety of options to self-identify both gender and sexual orientation. And it is very clear that the LGBTQ community is at much higher risk of basic needs insecurity. If you pull our national report from the website, you will see that. I will admit, we haven't done as much yet disaggregating that data and looking at intersections, for example, between race, ethnicity, and LGBTQ status. We're about to make our data set available to a set of additional researchers. We've been pursuing grants to be able to do that and to mentor a cohort of scholars. And one of our hopes there is that we're going to get some additional bandwidth so we can do those analyses. It is true across the country that the LGBTQ community is at more risk of homelessness, for example. We see that exacerbated in higher education, in part thanks to rules around financial aid and the extent to which the assumption is made time and again that a parent is supporting you just because you're a dependent, when in fact, students often don't get that support.
All right, that's great. One of the other questions that has come up is, do we know anything about some of the long-term impact from some of these short-term losses, like for short-term housing insecurity or short-term food insecurity? What's the impact 2 or 3 years down the road?
Yeah, we don't know that much yet because, to be honest, the first problem is we never bothered in the past to actually measure these things so that we could track the effect. I can tell you, from the broader literature, certainly from the K-12 literature, it doesn't, matter if you've been homeless for one night or a year. You certainly see bigger effects if you've been homeless for a year, but even one night has detrimental educational effects. And that's exactly why, the Department of Education is under a federal mandate to provide services and supports to a wide variety of people experiencing homelessness, including those who are couch surfing. In higher education, I strongly suspect, based on what we've seen so far, that both housing insecurity and homelessness will prove very disruptive to the odds a student completes a program or a degree. Food insecurity is a little trickier. There are levels to food insecurity, and we tend to see at least some negative effects for students who are not at the highest level, which means they're completely fine. So even students at the marginal low and very low levels have lower GPAs. It is not clear to us yet how lasting that is, and the extent to which the lower GPAs actually translate into lower rates of completion probably also depends on the institution and the extent to which you can still get by and get through, even if you have lower grades. My biggest concern, though, about food insecurity there is that students are more likely to lose their financial aid when their grades go down. So if we could modify our SAP practices, which institutions do have some ability to move around with, you can make some tweaks. If you modify your SAP practices, you may in fact have disproportionate benefits for students going through basic needs insecurity.
And as we think about those impacts on students, are there differences between retention impacts and graduation impacts? Like, we've talked a lot about the ultimate, graduation piece, but a lot of times students come back several semesters and build up, quite a bit of debt before they leave. And so debt is another major topic that we could talk about. And I'm just curious about, your thoughts on retention and the impact.
Yeah, let me speak to both of those things for a moment. And I'll tell you a little about, one of the programs that we've been working with is a program in Tacoma, Washington that is called the College Housing Assistance Program. It's a at this point, very uncommon, unusual partnership between the community college and the Public Housing Authority. The Public Housing Authority there has what are called moving to work dollars from HUD. And they're able to provide some additional flexibilities, which means we've been following a cohort of students who were homeless or near homeless as they actually tried to get support from a program. One of the most important things I can tell you is that, getting someone into housing does not immediately improve their odds of retention. Okay, and I could have told you that, frankly, just based on mentoring these students as well and seeing them in my classrooms. These traumas and challenges that build up when one is dealing with housing insecurity, the effects don't just simply go away overnight just because you got housing. They do, however, have positive effects, but it can take time to emerge. So I think that complicates this issue a little bit, right? It's quite possible that a student might not have enough time left in their college trajectory, or frankly, even in their amount of time they're allowed to have financial aid to have that recovery. Okay. It's also possible that someone has conditioned their assistance on getting their retention up, or, staying enrolled in the college is often a condition of continued assistance. And so if they stop out, they lose the assistance and then they spiral, right? This behooves us then to think about not conditioning assistance on immediate improvements in performance, or even necessarily on maintaining continuous enrollment, if our ultimate goal is to help keep that student connected to our college for the longer haul. So in other words, by continuing to support a student with food or housing even when they're not a student, you might actually facilitate their re-enrollment. Let me also say one thing about debt. We do have some indication that the students experiencing basic needs insecurity take on less debt to begin with, and that may be one of the causes. Now, debt is enormously complicated. We all know that in an ideal world, we would not be using debt to have students finance college, let alone community college. It would not be the primary mechanism. The problem is right now it is the primary mechanism. That means that if a student doesn't accept, even let's say their subsidized loan offered to them, they're going to try to go through college with less money. The result of that, studies are showing, is a lowered risk to retention and degree completion. That's really a sad fact, that very rigorous studies show that making students take loans or pushing them hard to take loans, nudging them towards it, is actually increasing their odds of degree completion and probably is increasing their odds of repayment, because usually the main driver of non-repayment is that you did not get your degree. It's a really tricky thing. I recognize that, especially in a community college context. But it may be the case that in some situations, your student could have another $3,000 to $5,000 a year, which would allow them to eat every day, if only they would accept the subsidized loans offered to them, or even the unsubsidized. And that is tricky, and that is counseling that has to happen in a context with an individual student. I will note, African-American students are more likely to take the debt. They have fewer choices in that matter. They often have bad credit and are unable to get a private loan. Latinx students are more likely to exhibit loan aversion in the first place and really not want to take those loans. Same thing with Southeast Asian populations and indigenous populations. So this is a complex area, though it really does deserve more attention.
Yeah, well, and one of the questions that just came up about that is looking at, community partnerships, right? Do you have some examples of some partnerships that people were able to have in the community that were really successful?
Well, we're studying a lot of those. And again, I hate to play the researcher and say, we don't have enough data yet, but the fact is, we don't have enough for me to say a lot of certainty. I will tell you, based on what I do see, and a lot of this is from our internal reporting, I'm feeling really good about models that essentially bring external partners to campus to provide additional supports, for example, in connecting students to public benefits programs, in providing some scaffolding around case management, and in around bridging things like rapid rehousing to your students. So, for example, in Seattle, the United Way of King County, which is a big and wealthier United Way than many of us have, they are running a program called Bridge to Finish. And they have set up and are providing benefits hubs on the community and technical college campuses. And the college does not have to pay for that. They have to provide space, and they have to contribute some emergency aid. We're in the middle of a rigorous evaluation of that. The first year of that is done, and a report is coming out. And it does look like it really is possible to build a strong partnership this way and really increase the support available. Part of the reason that that is affordable is that the United Way employs AmeriCorps Vistas to work in the program. And that seems pretty important. These folks do get some training, and that certainly saves the college money, at least as it works on doing more staff development and potentially bringing on social workers.
That's excellent, and we look forward to the research that will be coming out on that. I appreciate the research aspect of that. As we think about our survey results, you mentioned about how it was difficult probably for some populations to respond to an electronic survey during the COVID. But I was also wondering if you had any thoughts about the underreporting that tends to happen in general about these things, about students who are unwilling to say that they suffered, some version of homelessness or home insecurity or food insecurity.
Yeah, this is a big problem. I mean, it's a problem around the country, right? We have trouble identifying the students who, and the individuals who most need support. They're the least likely to come forward. And let's be honest, that's actually one of the reasons why they get into trouble in the first place, right? Is that we've structured a society that doesn't make help readily available and therefore requires you to raise your hand. And so the kinds of people who don't raise their hand as often are structured out of opportunities. I'm working with a team of mathematicians, actually, to try and devise ways to use existing data to detect signals and signs that might show up in our administrative records that would help us to know that a student could be in some trouble. And it's a tricky area to work in because I think we are all concerned about sort of privacy issues and big brother concerns and such. But we use that kind of data all the time to try to increase student success now in higher education. And we think that it should be used around basic needs and security because it really will help the students who are structurally disadvantaged here. So, this is another one where I'd say TBD, except for one thing. You do have access to one data point for your students to fill out the FAFSA that I'm pretty sure you're probably not using. And that is their negative expected family contribution. So this is me speaking to your financial aid office, and I would be happy to have a follow-up conversation. The expected family contribution can take on negative values. The federal government truncates it to 0. But we have another large study in multiple institutions where we are finding that very substantial fractions of 0 EFC students actually have a negative EFC, which means that their true unmet need is even higher than is currently being revealed. That has implications both for the student's cognizance and need to plan to fill that unmet need, and it means that you can probably rest assured that things like food and housing are going to be the first to go when the student can't pay their bills. So using the negative EFC more strategically might be something you could work on.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. So one of the other questions that has come up is, do you have other suggestions for things that we should be looking at and tracking as we think about how to help these students?
I mean, I know that we need to continue to improve the extent to which we make ourselves aware of these challenges on a term-by-term basis and the extent to which we're getting updated information on things like, do the students have children that they're helping care for, right? So I really think that it would behoove us to build into our learning management systems a starter welcome back to campus or welcome back to the semester, right? Just welcome to the term survey that, even if it's optional, allows the student to complete a standardized instrument around, looking at their food insecurity, understanding what their living situation is, understanding if there are children that they need to be caring for or other family members, getting, ask them over and over, for example, if they've been in foster care, because we know we have bad data on that. And even getting a more complete picture by asking more often might be helpful. I understand that students are burdened by surveys, but I will also tell you that the number one response they have when they're asked those questions is, thank you so much for caring enough to ask. So I'm doing this now as a welcome to my class. I use that information, of course, not to target any students, but to know what to say to them when they're struggling. So what I did was I just took the answers from each of my students and quickly sent them a note that said, first, thank you for sharing information with me. And secondly, I see you and hear you. If you're having trouble this semester juggling these things with your kids, and that's why your assignment's not coming in, I want you to flag it for me. I'm not saying to you, I'm letting you off the hook, I'm lowering my standards for you. I just think I'm a better teacher for knowing about it.
I think that idea about keeping the standard where they are is really important, but it's tough as we're transitioning into teaching these ways. One of the services that we're able to provide relatively easily on campus was to have some food pantries. Now, since we've gone remote, we have been able to have some drive-by, mobile markets where students could come through, but they're kind of infrequent. Do you have other thoughts about things that we could do to help specifically with some food insecurity, especially for some of these short-term things for people who've lost or had reduced employment?
I do. Yeah, I do, because this really, to me, this really highlights the limitations of campus food pantries. I really think the primary function of campus food pantries is to be a champion on campuses for addressing food insecurity. It's not to actually really reduce food insecurity with the food that it provides. Food pantries historically have never succeeded in doing that. And if you're interested, there's a wonderful book that I highly recommend by my friend Jan Poppendijk at CUNY called Sweet Charity, which is a history of food pantries in America and the effort to try to address food insecurity that way. I think a couple of things. First, SNAP. The answer is SNAP, right? SNAP is absolutely essential. And, one of the things we saw in the national survey that I was heartened by was while we usually see disparities between people with children, students with children, and students without children in terms of food insecurity, such that parenting students have higher rates, during the pandemic, we didn't see the disparity. And I think it's because there was such a push to get SNAP out to people with children through the school system. So parents were being supported, our students, right, who have children were being supported through K-12. Other people without children, though, were not being supported. So SNAP advocacy is critical, and connecting them to SNAP is absolutely critical. And let's be honest, if you're getting unemployment, that will also help you eat every day, right? So sometimes the best thing you can do for somebody is not provide the direct food, it's just to increase the cash flow in the household, okay? The other thing is, look, one of the lessons we've learned, we evaluated a big food scholarship program in Houston that required students to come to campus in order to access a pretty sizable amount of free food. And we saw very few of them actually come to campus to get the food. And we learned right away, well, the problem is it costs money and time to come to campus to get the food. And taking the bus home and all of that kind of stuff, is a real issue. So, especially when you're carrying groceries. So the answer they made clear to us is they want to be able to pick up that food out there in their communities. Isn't it possible to work with the local food bank to, let's say, tell your students on a given day that the food will come to them in a refrigerated truck and be parked in a parking lot in a couple of different communities that they can come over to? Isn't it possible to go and talk to some of your local grocery stores about offering vouchers so that they can go there? Students need to be able to go locally. They need choice. They need flexibility. And yes, many of your students, I do see a comment in the questions. Do your students qualify for SNAP? Some of them do, some of them don't. It's hard to speak to each category, especially given the complexity of the law, but it would be better for you to start with the assumption that they do and work from there only to find out they don't, rather than to start with the assumption they don't and then find out that most of them do.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And one of the questions that came up too is about when we ask students whether they, have these needs. A lot of times these surveys are done after we have, matriculated students. Are you aware of places that ask them at the time of, application or when they fill out the FAFSA or scholarships, as opposed to waiting until after they become students, and you see different results if you ask earlier?
Not yet. That is something that we really do want to see. However, I do want to flag for you, it is not a good idea to ask students these questions during high stakes moments. So if you ask about it on an application, a student is going to perceive themselves as likely to be discriminated against in your application process by sharing these things. Telling them you won't telling you won't use it for that purpose is not enough, okay? Secondly, it should not be on the FAFSA, again, for those same exact concerns. Also, there's just no chance that's gonna happen. The federal government is shortening it to the point that we're gonna have less information. But, again, a welcome survey, a student registers and they get it even before the classes start, yes. Because you should be pushing this stuff out. I was just talking with my institution about the fact that students are coming with concerns. We just started classes Monday, but I've been getting questions for weeks from students who needed to prepare for classes and needed laptops and such. And what the administration had decided was that the students would receive information about our Student Emergency Fund in the syllabus for each class, which they don't get till classes start. So in discussing why wouldn't we push it out sooner, they simply said, we're worried we're going to be overwhelmed. We're not going to have enough funds for everybody. And of course, that's completely understandable and very common. At the same time, it's really still not the right move. The right move is to let students know about available supports, even though you're likely to run out. You can level set expectations with them, and they appreciate it. And what you really want to know is every student who needs to raise their hand so that you can, even if you can't give them the limited support that you have, you can give them something else. You can at least give them some information that it costs you nothing to provide. And in an ideal world, I'd like to see some students employed through work study or another program to call those students as peer-to-peer listeners to say, listen, I know you put your hand up for this. I know you need help. The school doesn't have it right now, but what I can do is listen and just teach them to contact them once in a while just to say, how are you? We do have some internal evidence we have not published that suggests that goes a very long way, including around retention.
Well, and there's plenty of evidence out there already that just, that personal connection to students has such a lasting impact on their connection to the college and their, retention rates and graduation rates, right? So I think that is critically important. Well, I want to be, respectful of your time and everyone's time. We have covered a lot of great content here. This recording will be made available to everyone, and we'll send out a summary of the survey. One of the things that came up in the chat that I want to make sure that I highlight is reminder to everyone that the census is still open and people have not filled that out, right? It is not too late, right? Being counted is incredibly important. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Blaylock here for a few closing remarks. And again, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah, for coming and doing your presentation and agreeing to come back to the college and providing us with such an insightful presentation. We really appreciate it. I don't have very much more to say than that. If Dr. Pollard want to have a few closing remarks, that would be wonderful.
No, I just want to say thank you again to Sarah. Every time I'm sitting here writing so fast, I'm like, I need that line, and I can't get it as fast as she was saying it. And what I also love, and I just tweeted about this, and I'm going to say it here publicly because actually one of our faculty members raised this point. I'm calling it the Sarah Gojic-Robb effect. And he noted that the last time you were here, the college made significant advancement in our work around basic needs. And he called out the opportunity for us as an organization to really think about how we mobilize to disseminate this information that you just talked about. So I really want to thank you for what you do pragmatically. You bring the research and you know it and you are all in. But what you do for practical purposes to empower our organization, our faculty, and our staff, just thank you always for being here. And thank you to our Office of Institutional Research for their tremendous support, MCTV, and the recording that we'll have available. Just grateful to each and every one of us who really are thinking deliberately about how to make sure students are successful. And I hope to see you back at Montgomery College in person sometime in the near future, Sarah. And thank you to everybody who's able to be here.
Thank you so much.